Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
From the Center for Jewish History in Manhattan, welcome to a very special roundtable edition of L'Chaim for a discussion before a wonderful live audience here at the Center for Jewish History. I'm Mark Golub, and what a treat I have. Be sitting with five extraordinary people of intelligence and soul and passion and Jewish commitment who are about to tackle some very sensitive and controversial issues in the Jewish community. The tension that exists between the commitment in the Jewish people to freedom of expression, free speech, freedom of the press on the one hand, and also the fact that for Jews who care passionately about the state of Israel and want to defend Israel from anyone who would do harm to the Jewish state, how does one at sometimes balance between giving people the opportunity to speak or saying inside the Jewish community that we are drawing a line and we don't want that line to be crossed? And I want to say one thing also, and this is not a necessarily First Amendment issue at its core, because we're talking really about how the Jewish community deals with freedom of expression and free speech. But as you'll see in a moment, we have individuals here who are expert in some of the nuances of the First Amendment. I also want to mention very briefly how this program comes about and what the context of this program is. And it has to do with the way in which the Jewish commitment to freedom of speech and freedom of expression comes up against examples of stories in the New York Times, stories in Jewish media, whether it be in Jewish newspapers or on JBS, Jewish television. What happens when, and then this is what did happen, in April of this year, Marwan Barghouti writes an op-ed piece that is published by the New York Times. The Times takes a great deal of criticism because the Times never mentions that Marwan Barghouti is a convicted Palestinian terrorist who murdered 5 Israelis, including a Greek Orthodox priest, and who was serving 5 consecutive life sentences in an Israeli prison. And Barghouti writes an op-ed piece in which he slams Israel, slams the Israeli prison system, and announces he is going to go on a hunger strike. Then the Jewish Forward, which is one of the preeminent Anglo-Jewish papers, not in the country, in the world, comes up with faces a very delicate question. An organization known as JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, comes to the Forward and says it wants to purchase space in the Forward to run an ad. What's the ad? It's excerpts, it's actually 2 paragraphs, of Marwan Barghouti's letter that was published by the New York Times, verbatim. In Marwan Barghouti's voice, the ad slams Israel, slams the prison system, and basically says that all of Palestine will be free. You should know who JVP is. It is the largest and most influential Jewish anti-Zionist group in the United States. That's how it's described by the ADL. The ADL also writes, despite the neutral tone of its name, JVP works in Jewish opposition to the state of Israel and to steer public support away from the state of Israel. It then goes on to point out it's involved with the BDS movement. And again, what JVP says to the Forward is we want to buy space to run our ad. The ad reads, I'll read one paragraph. This is in Marwan Barghouti's voice. The eldest of my 4 children is now a man of 31. Yet here I am pursuing this struggle for freedom along with thousands of prisoners, millions of Palestinians, and the support of so many around the world. What is it with the arrogance of the occupier and the oppressor and their backers that makes them deaf to the simple truth? And then in bold, our chains will be broken before we are, because it is human nature to heed the call for freedom regardless of the cost. It's signed by Marwan Barghouti, leader of the Palestinian hunger strike, with a poster at the bottom of the ad with a handcuffed Barghouti under the title, "Palestine Will Be Free." And the JVP adds that one can obtain a free poster of the ad by going to the JVP website. It should also be noted that under the ad, the forward identifies JVP as having paid for the ad and has a disclaimer that says, "The views printed here are not intended to represent those of the forward." The forward also publishes, very important, especially for our discussion this evening, the forward also published on its editorial page a note from the forward's new publisher, Rachel Fishman Feddersen, which explained that, quote, "Despite the forward's reservations, the decision was made to publish the ad because," and here's the quote, "mass media itself is on the firing line, and freedom of expression is under pressure from our own government." And there you have the dilemma. If one feels that freedom of expression is under pressure, that the media is under assault from our own government, does that in some way change the equation? And by the way, one of the things that's so wonderful is we have the president of the forward with us tonight. In some way, it's not fair to him, because we're using the forward as a test case.
I think it's fair.
That's Thane Rosenbaum, whom you'll hear from in a minute. But I just want to make sure everybody understands. I'm a fan of the forward. I think Jane Eisner is out of this world. I have been a friend of Sam Norich forever. This is not a slam on the forward. It is, however, an honest discussion of, did the forward make a mistake? Or better said, I'm very anxious to hear, if the forward had it to do over, would they do anything different? That's tonight's discussion. Let me introduce you now to our spectacular panel. First, Floyd Abrams enjoys the most prestigious position on the American scene as the preeminent trial and appellate legal authority dealing with First Amendment issues in this country. A senior counsel at the litigation firm of Cahill, Gordon, and Rindell, Floyd Abrams has argued frequently before the Supreme Court on First Amendment cases, and among his myriad high-profile cases, he represented Judith Miller in her efforts to avoid revealing her confidential sources. Floyd has argued First Amendment issues for both the left and the right. He's represented Nina Totenberg in NPR against the government's investigation into leaks. And he recently successfully argued on behalf of Senator Mitch McConnell and the rights of corporations and unions to speak publicly about politics in Citizens United's case against the federal government. And Floyd has been traveling the country on a speaking tour for his newest book, The Soul of the First Amendment, published by Yale Press. It's an extraordinary honor to have sitting with us a First Amendment giant. Please welcome Floyd Abrams. Amanda Berman is the Director of Legal Affairs at the Lawfare Project and is the project's liaison to both the American and American Jewish communities. Amanda Berman has also written extensively on lawfare and counterterrorism, and Amanda has worked on a number of cases or issues with Floyd Abrams. Please welcome Amanda. Sam Norich is one of the most highly respected figures on the world Jewish scene, making contributions to so many corners of Jewish life. Sam Norich has served as Vice President of the World Jewish Congress, as Executive Director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and as the most courageous voice on the Claims Conference, which is mandated to distribute reparations paid by Germany to Holocaust survivors. But Sam Norich is perhaps most well known as a giant in the field of Jewish journalism, publishing both the English and Yiddish editions of the Forward for 19 years until becoming president of the Forward in 2016. And again, given the fact that the Forward is part of the whole discussion, it's especially lovely of Sam to make sure he's here. Welcome, Sam Norich. Thane Rosenbaum is someone you've seen many, many times here on JBS, always sitting by my side.
Floyd, get up.
Yes. No matter where you are, you're at my side. Thane is a wonderful award-winning novelist and essayist who writes passionately on matters affecting the state of Israel. Thane is also a distinguished fellow at NYU Law School and runs his own forum on law, culture, and society. And appropriately enough for tonight's program, Thane's upcoming book is entitled The High Cost of Free Speech, Rethinking the First Amendment. Thane Rosenbaum. And Eric Yoffie is also someone you've seen many times here on JBS. Eric is President Emeritus of the URJ, the Union for Reform Judaism. He's an outstanding columnist who appears in Haaretz, as well as publications like the Huffington Post, many other Jewish and secular publications. Eric is also a frequent scholar in residence throughout the country, and you can read Eric online at ericyoffie.com. Welcome, Eric Yoffie. Thank you so very much for joining me. What a kick it is for me. Sam, it is only fair I begin with you.
Happy to.
So, look, Sam, there are obviously many in the Jewish community who think the Forward made a mistake by selling ad space to JVP for the Marwan Barghouti voice. I'd love to know how you view it. I have no idea whether you were part of the discussion, and it sounded from Rachel as if it was a struggle inside the Forward to decide whether you should or should not take the ad. I'd love to know what your position was during the discussion, if you had one, and how would you explain it? Are there other factors which you think we should understand as to why the Forward took an ad in the voice of someone who is obviously an enemy of the state of Israel?
Yes. First of all, the decision was made not by the editor-in-chief.
Correct.
This was never an editorial matter. The decision was made by our publisher and CEO, Rachel Fishman-Feddersen. She consulted with a few people, including myself, and yeah, there was a struggle, I think, in her own mind. You neglected in your lengthy intro to quote the full hesitation that we articulated on the editorial page, in which we mentioned that Barghouti was convicted of the murder of 5 Israelis, and the fact is that the ad was not given to us by a Palestinian organization. It was given to us by Jewish Voice for Peace. Now, we disagree with Jewish Voice for Peace. On BDS, we've editorialized against BDS. We've editorialized against their actions in the Linda Sarsour case. We've editorialized against against their action in bringing the Palestinian woman to their convention in Chicago. we've made it clear what our positions were. But here was the question, look, we are publishers. That's our job for this community. And we have an obligation to bring a full spectrum of opinion before the community. Now, the fact that JVP is a Jewish organization may not matter to you, but it matters to us. And the fact that they've been condemned by some in the Jewish community ought not to deprive them of their right to have a voice, even though we disagree with it. The test of free speech is not whether you give it to people who that you agree with. The question is, what are you prepared to allow to be said by people who you disagree with? And in this particular case, we felt that the antidote to bad speech is good speech. To let contrary voices have their say, and not to ban this voice. Now, we didn't see it as a cause célèbre after it was published. JTA didn't regard it as a cause célèbre after it was published. They didn't make an issue of it. Other publications didn't until JNS did, the Jewish News Service, funded by Sheldon Adelson. They have their right, although to call it a news service, I think, is stretching the moniker. But they have their right, and JBS, of course, picked up on it. And picked up on it in a way that I think failed to give the full background to your listeners. And I said that to you yesterday, saying that the intro, which paired the forward with the New York Times, was tendentious and unfair because you refused to mention, you knew, but refused to mention that we did point out that he was convicted of murder, and that the ad was given to us not by Marwan Barghouti. Now, we live in a time when these issues are more difficult than they've ever been. I remember 30 years ago when "We Are One" was the slogan. You could say that about Israel then. You can't say that about Israel now. Rabbis in the Reform and conservative movement, many of them are afraid to speak about Israel because whatever you say, you offend some members of your congregation. Defending Israel, we've been supporters of a state for Jews since before there was a Jewish state, and have never wavered in that. But defending Israel has a ring to it that it connotes defending the policies of the current Israeli government. And that we have a harder time doing. We certainly welcome opinions that not only defend the policies of the current government, but admire the policies of the current government. And that's also part of the Jewish community. And we should reflect that. But in our own voice, in our own editorials, we don't see an antinomy, a choice that we have to make between freedom of speech and defending Israel. we try to be maximalists when it comes to freedom of speech, considering how endangered it is today. And look, I belong to several organizations whose job is defending Israel. And I think we do it quite effectively. But that's not the job of a publisher for the Jewish community.
Okay. I'm going to hold any defense of JBS for the moment. Maybe we'll get to it later on. Thane, what's your reaction?
Oh, there's so much to say. First of all, I should make a disclosure. I think it's important. I have written at least 25 pieces for the Forward since the early 90s. I was part of that first wave when Sam essentially, revitalized this paper, brought it back from the dead. 3 years ago, they wrote a very negative story about me that I also thought was factually incorrect, and I have not written for them since. So I thought you should at least know this backstory to filter in my responses, might have something to do with that history.
Does it?
Of course. I'm a human being. Of course it does. That's not why I said it's fair. I just thought that it was ridiculous to say that the president and the former publisher of the Forward, it's not fair to him to be in a position to have to defend and explain this decision. I thought it's completely fair.
Right.
This is what he does for a living, and I would think that he would embrace the moment.
That's
right?
why he's here.
Hineni.
Yeah. Okay. Look, the Jewish Voice for Peace. Sam says, well, they're a Jewish organization. They're not. Okay. They're tantamount to a Palestinian terrorist organization. So.
What is
he says? No, he says, well, they have the word Jewish in it. Well, most people in this room do not think Jews for Jesus is a Jewish organization. So I just think that's intellectually dishonest, and he has no respect for you from when he tells you, oh, it's a Jewish organization. You're smarter than that. It's not a Jewish organization. Its positions are no different than Islamic Jihad and Hamas. I mean, their position is there should be no Jews. There should be no Jews at all in Israel. So I don't see how he feels better about that. Secondly, his discussion about freedom of expression is I'm sorry, it's idiotic. If you felt that way, Sam, you put it in the editorial section. Why are you selling them an ad? If you felt so strongly that freedom of expression is under attack, give them an op-ed. I mean, and in fact, I don't even understand. I'm happy at least you took money from them. But the idea, I was afraid that you actually did it pro bono, but the idea, and by the way, you all know, for all of this sort of smugness about, look at us, we're protecting free speech, look at us. The reality is, let's look at what the Palestinians think. They're laughing at the Forward. Every night when they go to sleep, they look at the Forward and go, can you believe these Jews? Can you believe these Jews? I want to know what Palestinian newspaper or television gives equal time to the Jewish Defense League, sells them an ad. By the way, the Jewish Defense League never slit the throat of any Palestinian children. They don't ram cars into people. They don't indiscriminately bomb communities. So just so we can know, but no, I don't know of any Palestinian organization that's ever granted, a news organization, granted that openness and of generosity of spirit. But I want to know, why not put it in the editorial page if you feel that strongly about it? Now, with respect to this disclaimer, thank you, Sam, that the Forward acknowledged that this is a mass murderer, 5 people that he's killed. The idea in the New York Times, by the way, I've written at least half a dozen op-eds for them. So just to say, I have some experience. In that case, Sam seems to think there's a distinction. Don't lump us the same. And I'm not sure, he said he didn't explain why it's different. I don't see why it's different. At least the New York Times, they took the position, well, we think that Marwan Barghouti's struggle in an Israeli prison is worth calling attention to, okay? By the way, I was just curious, before I get to that, Sam, I'm just curious if organizations that supported white supremacy came to you and said, we'd like to buy an ad, would you sell them an ad? If an organization that supported the Ku Klux Klan came to you and said, we can't get a break in this culture, no one will give us any space, we came to the forward. If organizations that support pedophiles said, pedophiles simply do not receive constitutional justice in this country, surely you'll give us a voice. I find it odd that the only one that we're using, the test case that the Forward using, is the Jewish Voice for Peace, one Jewish organization that believes in dead Jews. And then the one last thing, I do think there's a difference between running an ad, actually going out running an ad, and then calling it as if, look at this, he says, well, we're in the news business after all. Well, ads are the commercial piece of it, and it's just different.
I'm going to give Sam a chance to answer, but I want to hear first what Eric has to say.
I'm somebody who was deeply distressed by the ad, truly upset by the ad, and at the same time felt that the Forward probably did the right thing. Let me say that I was head of the reform movement for 16 years. We had a magazine, a very good magazine, went to 320,000 homes, top writers. Would we have accepted this ad? And the answer is never.
Because?
We're a religious organization. We're committed to certain religious principles. We serve congregations that are committed to those principles as well. So the survival and the welfare of the Jewish people and the Jewish state are central to who we are. And I would have seen this as contrary to those values.
But you still said you think the Forward did the right thing.
Yes. So I don't believe that any synagogue would have, in their publication, would have done it. I don't think synagogue or organizations would have done it. The Forward, I don't understand the distinction Thane was trying to make here between the Forward and the New York Times. In my view, the Forward is closer to the New York Times. And by virtue of that, it's an independent newspaper.
What do you mean by closer?
In other words, it's not a religious publication. It's not simply an arm of the Jewish community. It's an independent newspaper with socialist origins, with aspirations for broader appeal, and with influence that goes beyond the Jewish community. And so what's the reality about Marwan Barghouti? He's a Palestinian leader. All right. That's repugnant to me. I would like the Palestinians to have different leaders who are not terrorists. And I would like them to have a totally different political culture. The fact of the matter is, he is a recognized, significant leader in the Palestinian world, for better or for worse as far as I'm concerned. And news media have a responsibility to provide an opportunity for recognized leaders to express themselves. Was I happy to see him in the New York Times? I was furious in a certain way. We're giving a platform to a terrorist. But the point is, he wasn't just any terrorist. He is arguably the most important Palestinian leader who exists today, and that's what news media do. If you're part and parcel of the Jewish religious community, you have different calculations. That would have been the way I would have responded. But for the Forward to do this, and again, the notion that an op-ed is somehow better than an ad, it seems to me we're more flexible with ads than the other way around. You know, in the New York Times, there are ads by Russia and China and North Korea and Saudi Arabia, and nobody nobody says a word, because the commercial dimension somehow is accepted as a normal part of the business. So for all of these reasons, as troubled as I was, as upset as I was, as repugnant as I feel that Barghouti is, I wasn't particularly distressed when the Forward did it. And Sam, I think you're too defensive. I think you ought to be more assertive about the rights that you have as an independent publisher in the world.
No one is suggesting the Forward doesn't have the right.
And this is not a free speech issue. I sit here with the greatest free speech expert in our country. There is no right here to publish an ad. There's no constitutional guarantee to publish an ad. That's not the question here. It's an issue of policy and of values.
That's right.
for an independent Jewish paper that has Jewish associations, but nonetheless is not part of the religious world. So that's the way that I see it.
Okay. You know, it's like Tevye. You're right and you're right. I don't come away understanding why it seems to offend you so much, and that if you would not have published it in the Reform magazine, when you were the head of the URJ, I don't know why, and you said you were angry at the Forward. No one's questioning their right. The question is it somehow required by the Forward? When Sam says he wants to give every side a voice, Eric, should the Jewish community give Marwan Barghouti a voice because the Jewish community should give everyone a voice?
This is a paid ad. So first of all, the notion that we're, quote, giving him a voice.
You even said, there's no distinction to you between an ad and an editorial. And this was an ad that was, although paid for, wait a minute, it was paid for by JVP. However, it was written in Marwan Barghouti's voice. I didn't care who paid the Forward for it. What the Forward did was it took an ad in Barghouti's voice. And while Sam has every right to be critical in any way he wants of JBS, I said to him, and I'm saying to him now, all we said on JBS, and on JBS, by the way, we did a half-hour show on this. I began by saying who JVP was. I quoted the ADL. It was clear to everyone from whom the ad came. But the problem, and for me, both as a Jewish journalist and as a committed Jew, I think this is a very tricky issue. For me, it doesn't matter who paid you. It matters what the ad was about and who was saying it. In this instance, all the Forward did was slap in the paper a speech by Marwan Barghouti, right out of, by the way, Eric, lifted, letter for letter, word for word, from the New York Times op-ed piece.
Look,
and I don't understand why, on the one hand, you said it bothers you so much, but still, and you wouldn't do it yourself, but you're happy that the Forward did it.
I'm not happy that the Forward did it. I never said I was happy that the Forward did it. I said I understood what the Forward was doing. Look, are there red lines? Thane raised, a legitimate issue here. There are certain people who should, never be in the Forward or anywhere else. I mean, Holocaust deniers, anti-Semites.
The world is flat.
Well, wait a minute. Marwan Barghouti's an anti-Semite.
Marwan Barghouti, again. Marwan Barghouti, no one hears me defending him. It is hard to maybe accept the reality, which is the reality nonetheless. He is a leader of the Palestinian people, and one can imagine a whole variety of circumstances under which he would be negotiating on the behalf of the Palestinian people with the United States government and so on. That's why the New York Times published him. That's why he's a person of consequence, and people of consequence in the political world get an opportunity to express their political voices.
I want to ask Amanda to comment. I just want to point out, Marwan Barghouti is going to spend the rest of his life in prison. It's interesting that the Palestinian people, for any reason at all, want somebody who is in prison to be their leader, and I don't understand why that alone somehow tips the balance for you. Because a community, forget Palestinian, any community, chooses to in some way glorify a murderer, a wanton murderer. He was trying to blow up the Jerusalem Mall.
I know.
The fact that the Palestinian people may, and I'm not as sure as you are that the Palestinian people are behind Marwan Barghouti, but if they were, why would I want to add to his credibility, his international stature? And by taking the ad, which you wouldn't put in Reform Judaism.
Never.
You
Never
are,
crossed my mind.
you are enhancing his stature and credibility.
We don't get to choose Palestinian leaders. You know,
Okay.
I know that may be difficult. It's difficult for you. It's difficult for me.
I know.
We don't get to make that choice. And if the reality is that he's a person of influence and consequence in that world, then he gets to express himself in ways that are troubling to me, but reflect the realities of our political circumstances.
Okay, we've gone around this once. Go ahead, Amanda.
Well, I think that last point by Eric really proves the opposite conclusion, because the only way Marwan Barghouti becomes a leader of the Palestinian people is by getting out of jail and challenging Abbas. So now we have a Jewish publication and the New York Times giving him a platform with, to go along with this hunger strike, which is clearly intended to raise his profile in the Palestinian community and give him credibility with the Palestinians. And we are now working to help, in a sense, get him out of jail and challenge Abbas and become a leader. So he doesn't get there unless we're helping him. So I just don't understand how we can say that that's what gives him, he has the credibility and that's why we're publishing him. It's the inverse. He gets it by publishing.
How did you feel about the ads, the forwards publishing the ad?
Well, I want to say also I found it outrageous, I'll say that. I want to say also that the suggestion that it wasn't important to the Jewish community, Sam, or that it wouldn't have been noticed had it not been for JNS, which is funded by Sheldon Adelson. There are a lot of wonderful Jewish groups that are funded by Sheldon Adelson, like Birthright, which is changing the entire, diaspora Jewish community and support for Israel around the world. A lot more, that we couldn't even list if we had 4 hours right now. And I would really be interested for you to look into who's funding JVP. If that's how you're going to judge an organization, I think that would be a good challenge for you. I think the ad was outrageous. I think it's outrageous that the Forward was making money off of the ad. I actually think is worse than the New York Times because the mission statement for the Forward, Eric said that this is not a Jewish entity, a Jewish newspaper. The mission statement says that this is the editorial winner or something. I forget exactly what it was, but that the Jewish Forward, no longer called the Jewish Forward, now just called the Forward, but created as the Jewish Daily Forward, claims to be the editorial leader for the international Jewish community. So I don't know how you divorce that Jewish aspect and say, it's not a Jewish publication. So if you are intending to reach the Jewish community, there could be members of the Jewish community who are subscribers to the Forward whose family members were murdered by Marwan Barghouti. How do you respond to that if you get a newspaper that you're paying for that has an ad for someone who murdered your brother, your sister, or your mother? So, just on journalistic integrity and ethics and human morals, I think it was repugnant.
So, Professor, I'm thinking to myself, this has got to be interesting to you.
Oh, it is.
As
it
you
is.
hear that, okay.
And I'm very glad I was called on last.
I want to ask you one question first. Who are you as a Jew? What's your Jewish background? We know all these people. Who are you?
Oh, I was brought up in a background so secular that I didn't go to Hebrew school when everyone else around me was going to Hebrew school.
You escaped.
I was bar mitzvahed, but that was my father coming into our local Reform synagogue in Rego Park and saying, my son is 12, I think he'll be angry at me when he grows up if he's not bar mitzvahed, which is true. I would have been. So I came from an a-religious but deeply Jewish
I understand.
background. So in the meantime, just so you know, I've married an Israeli woman. It's 53 years.
Mazel tov.
Toda rabba.
You've given us a context. What do you think of this discussion?
I have some views which are markedly different, but I'm curious how I'm going to come out at the end. Let me start with what I feel.
So are all of us.
Yeah.
Beloved always.
Let me start with what I'm comfortable saying. First, I guess another disclosure. For many years, I represented the New York Times, And while I have not represented them for a number of years now, I represented them in the Pentagon Papers case and for 30 years, 40 years thereafter. So I have a relationship there. I didn't have any trouble at all with the Times publishing the piece. It was outrageous not to disclose that he had been convicted of murder, no less, and not to disclose even more than that. But I think that the op-ed pages of the Times ought to be open to, and they have been open, to other killers as well, from other countries, some very bad people who run other countries, who have had op-ed pieces in the Times through the years. I view the forward differently. I do view it, I read it, I do view it as a Jewish publication. And I was surprised that when I learned of all this, that they had taken the ad. I don't distinguish between taking it as an ad or doing it as an op-ed piece. I really don't think that matters. It was a decision at the highest level of the newspaper, as it would have been, as it was, in my experience, for some op-ed pieces in the New York Times in the past. And therefore, while it's on the commercial side, it was in the end an editorial decision as well. And I don't think we ought to think of it, in fact, I think it demeans the forward, to treat it as simply a commercial decision because somebody came in with money and was prepared to pay it. I guess my reaction in the end of the day is this. A, it was very brave of the forward to publish it. They get nothing good for themselves out of doing it. The abuse, the criticism, the anger directed at them was predictable, and they knew, I'm sure, that it would come. That said, my own reaction is the Jewish Voice for Peace is a stridently anti-Israeli publication from beginning to end. Anti-Zionist, you quoted earlier, but there is nothing in Israel. The Israeli left has nothing to do and has nothing in common with the Jewish Voice for Peace. Shimon Peres, Rabin, all the Israeli leaders of the past and the current leaders of the Labor Party in Israel would have nothing to do and have no relationship with and share no values with a publication, with an organization which is devoted to anti-Israeli activities and advocacy. I think that if I ran a Jewish publication, I would have thought the following. One, the fact that the press is under pressure, and it is, and I write about that a lot, is not of justification. And to me, it's not even relevant. If you think the press is under pressure, write an op-ed piece denouncing the president. That's if you think it comes from Washington. My reaction is that I wouldn't have done it. I think for a Jewish publication to do it validates in a way that the New York Times does not by publishing it. It establishes them as, it establishes Jewish Voice for Peace and the writer as worthy of serious consideration, not necessarily acceptance, but it makes Jewish Voice for Peace a player. And I don't view them as that, and I don't think the Jewish community ought to view them as that in terms of their views and their activities through the years. So I think I would have said no, but if I had lost the vote there, I would have thought well of my colleagues who were willing to take the heat in doing it.
I have the same problem that I had with Eric. I heard yes and no at the same time. And
Well, sometimes subtlety, you know.
I'm not sure subtlety and contradiction are exactly the same. But again, Eric's point was that Barghouti is somebody in the Palestinian world. And I'm curious to know, as someone who has defended, again, this, everyone understands, this is not a classic free speech issue. But you're here because you're sensitive to not only that, you know, the absolutist of the problem, but all that surrounds it. And you heard Eric say, this is someone of stature. And that's part of the reason why he says, I wouldn't have done it, I didn't like it, but they did the right thing.
That's why I think the Times should have published it. By the way, I think he'll be out of prison someday. Everybody may be sure that he's in prison for life. I'm not sure he's in prison for life. Trades have been made, arrangements have been made in the past.
Does that change the equation?
No, but it means that things have been said are either incorrect or I'm incorrect. And it means that he's not to be discounted as someone of importance. He is one of the leading Palestinians alive today in terms of his ability to communicate with the Palestinian people and to speak to the world. It makes them all the more dangerous. But he is an important player. But that's why I don't think the Times erred, apart from the terrible non-disclosure by the Times. I think of a Jewish publication as having added, I don't want to say obligations, because I mean they have every right, not just legal right, but to make their own editorial decision about what to do. But I think at the end of the day, that you know, my general attitude certainly, and what I've done for the last 50 years, has been to resist governmental censorship in one way or another of newspapers, broadcasters, magazines, the internet, whatever. I mean, we all know the First Amendment that doesn't apply here. The forward has a First Amendment right to publish or not, to take the ad or not, to choose to put him in there or not. That's the First Amendment here. But I guess my overview of the role of an outwardly Jewish publication is that it should take account in a way that I don't ask the New York Times to take account of the legitimization that it gives to both the sponsor of the ad and the hero of the ad.
One more question for you. When the New York Times publishes an op-ed, it is making something of a decision. Very often they will publish something with which they agree. They have rejected op-ed pieces written by major Jewish diplomatic statesmen, like the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Danny Ayalon. They have repeatedly rejected his op-ed pieces. And at the same time, they are accepting Marwan Barghouti's. This isn't pure theory. And you've been close to this because you've been inside the process. You've been inside the Times process. Yeah. Does that in any way, should we as a public, as a Jewish community, in any way factor that into the way in which the New York Times, which is for many in the Jewish community, It is still the Bible of record. It is quoted by Jews as if it is sacrosanct. Is there something about the reality, the process that you've seen and understand that should in any way modify the way in which the Jewish community reacts when an editorial, an op-ed piece is rejected and we don't know about it, and then one is chosen, which is virulently anti-Israel, and where the Times makes a decision not to go public with the fact who this guy is?
I don't think they made a decision. I think that was
Just a
more
mistake?
an error
Okay.
than a decision, but maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No.
I mean, if you really want to, the op-ed page is run by different people who run the editorial page, and surely different people that covered the news. And if you think that there are orders afoot, that has never been the case. What may have been the case, and I think in some cases have been, is a coolness, sometimes an iciness, with respect to Israel in the Times. I think what has often been in the on-the-ground coverage, an unfairness in the coverage, not orders from above. Look, I have a friend that used to call the op-ed page Fatah Land. And I don't think it's fair to compare one op-ed piece by a terrorist. I mean, the Times op-ed page is not filled with Palestinian terrorist expression of views. So I really wouldn't draw much conclusions from giving him that opening. But I think what it does suggest is that, whoever is now, and I don't know who it is now, whoever's running the op-ed page now, is not, he is not someone who would take an ISIS op-ed piece. Mm-hmm. He or she is very likely someone, surely, would not take a racist op-ed piece, the point you made earlier. It's not unfair to draw whatever conclusions you want to about who is off limits. I mean, we talked earlier here tonight about drawing lines. That's very difficult, and more often than not, they're unspoken and often not even thought about consciously at the Times and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. News decisions made about covering any foreign country. I mean, look how little foreign news there is now. I mean, Israel tends to do better when they're not in the news. So I just offer that as my general observation.
You've been so patient, and everybody is now taking a whack at you. You can answer now anything you'd like.
I would hesitate, Thane, to decide that Jewish Voice for Peace is not a Jewish organization, or, as you put it, tantamount to Palestinian terrorism. You know as much history as I, and you know about the mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger, whose notorious line was, "Wer ein Jude ist, bestimme ich." Who is the Jew? I will decide. We don't decide that. I disagree with much of JVP. I disagree with almost everything. But I know some rabbis, and I know some civilians who I think are Jews, who belong to JVP, who have come to the end of their rope with the Netanyahu government. I'm a lifer. I have not come to the end of my rope. I even see the possibility that Netanyahu government, like the government in 1979, could actually come to a peace agreement. Could happen. But when a Jewish organization comes to us and says, we are asking you to take this, they were not doing us any favors, as Floyd rightly pointed out. When I saw that, I said, oh ja, Glück hat mich getroffen. What luck landed on my head just now? But again, we're publishers. And we felt we should allow them to convey this view. We said as much as we could in saying we don't agree with it on the editorial page. And we leave it up to our readers to decide. Now, you heard 2 yeses and nos from Floyd and from Eric.
Reluctant yeses.
Yes. And from me, you heard a no and a yes.
Yes. I heard a lot, but I heard more yes from you.
That's right, because that's where Rachel came down. That's the decision she made. And I think it was the right decision. And if we had to do it again, knowing
all the wisdom here, yes?
Yes, right. All the flack we would take for it, we'd do it again. That's what it means to have an independent Jewish newspaper.
I don't believe him. I don't believe you that you would do it again. I think you have to say that, but I don't believe that you would do it again. Maybe I'm wrong.
You're wrong.
Okay. I think, first of all, the suggestion that there's anything you agree with that has ever come out of JVP, I would be interested to hear what that is. And the suggestion that Thane is wrong to say that they're not a Jewish group, I completely disagree with also, because it's the same thing. It really is the same thing as like saying the Jewish Palestinian Authority or the Jewish Hamas. Their positions are the same. They believe that there should be no Jews in Israel. Thane already said this, but they believe that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They chant it all across campuses, all around this nation. So I don't see how it's, I just don't see how it's a Jewish perspective. Sorry, Thane, really quickly, I think that every time someone's trying to defend themselves for publishing this incredibly anti-Israel, not necessarily publishing, but supporting this incredibly anti-Israel narrative, they're saying that, well, it's just the Bibi government, it's just the Netanyahu government. The state of Israel is run by the government that is democratically elected by the people of Israel. And whoever's in charge is maintaining a Jewish homeland for us too. So if you attack Israel because you don't like Bibi, you're shooting yourself in the foot, and that's just to say the least.
I don't think Sam said it quite that way.
First of all, when you chant from the river to the sea, that's a genocidal song. So let's just be clear what it means. When you say Palestine will be free and from the river to the sea, because that's the rhyme, that's the song, it doesn't mean, and Jews will just go back to Brooklyn, right? It means we want there to be Judenrein in this country. And so this idea that this is somehow, there's something Jewish about that organization. But let me just,
you won't lose the thought. That's the problem which we want to hear you speak to. I know your commitment. And it's interesting, I don't believe you're only defending this because you're defending your publisher. Ultimately, when you hear Thane say, when you hear Amanda say, there's nothing the JVP is, when you hear Floyd say it, there's nothing JVP says that is consistent with your goals. Your goals are not the destruction of the state of Israel. What do you answer Thane and Amanda when they say, if there's a group that says, from the river to the sea, and Floyd, you're going to have to speak this too, at that point has a group crossed a line where at that point, even the forward has no Jewish obligation to give them a voice.
And the fact that some stupid rabbi joined the organization doesn't make it a Jewish organization. I mean, that's what he told you. You heard him say. He said, there's a rabbi somewhere who joined it. Oh, okay, it's a Jewish organization.
Sam?
I won't answer that.
Okay.
Well, you should. Don't speak and then respond. We try to make some sense here.
6 years ago, we were proffered an ad by the David Horowitz Freedom Center against Obama. And it said that he was raising up Hamas, that he was throwing Israel under the bus. I can't recall the full list, the whole litany. And the question was, do we take the ad? My opinion as publisher at the time was that every word in the ad was a lie, including is and the. But I didn't feel like our task was to evaluate the truth value of what they were claiming. I saw it as an expression of political opinion. And we ran the ad. And we got flack from people who said, look how low the Forward has stooped, that it now takes money to print this kind of thing. You asked, where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
Well, for me, the question is, who decides that? Increasingly, there is pressure on curators, publishers, cultural directors of all sorts to avoid controversy. And it has manifested itself in San Francisco, it has manifested itself in Washington, it's manifested itself in New York, where conservative activists have mobilized to ban certain artistic presentations. Sometimes major donors have joined conservative activists and said, you run this, I'm taking all my money and going. So we live in a period where this is not a matter of conjecture. It's not a matter of, what's the word? Could this happen? It's happening.
Okay.
But
You said I could finish.
Yeah, you will finish.
Let me just tell you one more story. 10 years ago, I got a phone call from Sheldon Adelson. We had published 4 columns. We had a broadsheet at the time, and we had published a 4-column photograph of 7 Hamasniks who had been killed by a Tzahal helicopter raid in Gaza. They were laid out under green flags. And we published it above the fold. Mr. Adelson said, why do you publish a picture like that? And I said, I'm sorry, what do you mean? And he said, it just elicits sympathy for them. And I said, Mr. Adelson, I actually question whether it elicits sympathy for them. But, the fact is that this was the major story of the week, so we put it front and center on the front page. And he said, that's not the way you should do your journalism. You should think about what helps Israel and what hurts Israel, and make your decisions based on that. course, it's what he thinks would help or hurt Israel. And I said, I'm sorry, Mr. Adelson, but I think we're going to have to agree to disagree about that.
What does this have to do with Sheldon Adelson? What happened with this ad? What does this have to do with Sheldon Adelson?
He's just saying that there is a perspective in the Jewish community that he is now illustrating and reacting to. Incidentally, I've never met Sheldon.
It's not coming from the federal government. It's not coming from Trump. It's coming from some supporters of Trump, but that happens to be a coincidence. But there is a mobilized faction in the Jewish community that is seeking to censor.
Okay, by the way, again, it is so fascinating to hear all of you speak, and every point you make could be an hour in and of itself. The answer that I've heard people say is, it's not about whether you're creating sympathy for Hamas in a way that is integral to what's going on. The reality is that there were photographs taken, were permitted and not permitted, and ultimately, there were many, many Jews who were on tarmacs and who were in buildings and who also lost their lives. And when the Forward runs that kind of paper, what bothers an Adelson or what bothers others is it feels as if the Forward, which is known to lean left, is basically saying, look at how inhumane Israel is. And what Adelson is reacting to, and he may have said it the way he said it, has to do with, to what extent does a Jewish publication or a Jewish television channel have a responsibility to see a larger picture here? Hamas and Israel are not equal. I'm sorry anybody dies, but in the war in Gaza, the way in which the general media portrayed it was, Hamas was losing a lot of people, Israel was not, and Thane Rosenbaum writes a piece about Hamas and what they're doing to standing behind children, and he is pilloried in the Jewish community.
By his paper.
And all of a sudden, Thane Rosenbaum is no more a liberal. I have a conversation about this panel. You listen to this. So I named some of the people I want on the panel. I named Eric, I named Floyd, I named Sam, I named you, I named Alan Dershowitz. And the reaction was, your panel is too far right. I said, it's too far right? Is Alan Dershowitz on the right? Is Thane Rosenbaum on the right? And I realized from them that something horrible has happened inside the Jewish community. If you stand up and say, Israel is being maligned, it doesn't mean Israel is perfect. It just means that Israel is in an impossible position fighting people who say, no matter what, it's from the river to the sea. If you continue to support Netanyahu and Israel, no matter how liberal you are, Thane, on every other issue in the world, you're going to be called on the right. And that's a tragedy in Jewish life today. We could go all night. We only have a few more minutes left. I did stop you, and then I want Eric.
First of all, I don't know Sheldon Adelson. But please, if you're watching, shower me with your largesse. I don't think there's anything wrong with a Jewish philanthropist, whether you agree with his politics or not, to assume that a Jewish paper is not going to put out material that is going to embarrass the Israelis or put them in a lesser position. I don't think there's anything surprising or shocking about it. As for the New York Times likes. It's not unfamiliar for them to run pieces that put Israel in an embarrassing light. So this is not surprising. So that's why I have no objection, nor do I'm surprised that they would run the Barghouti essay. It's outrageous that they didn't do the ID line, because I've written 6 op-eds for them. And I can tell you, I'm always asking them to, in the ID line, to pump a new book for me. And they say to me, no, your ID line is there to demonstrate why you're the expert on this topic. So this is not for you to say what you want. And so for them to not to identify that he's a murderer, and that's why he's in prison, as opposed to he's a political prisoner, is really intellectually dishonest, morally wrong, violates every journalistic ethical code that I can imagine. And it's hard to believe, Floyd, that that wasn't to some degree intentional, not that it was a mistake. It's just hard to believe, because I can tell you, Floyd, when Thane Rosenbaum publishes an op-ed there, they're all over my ID line. They're all over me. They want to make sure every word it identifies why I'm there. As a Jewish community, I'm just asking you honestly, are we not yet tired? Are you tired at all about elevating or ennobling murderous thugs and turning them into statesmen? Right? Didn't we already make a mistake as Jews, even with Camp David, turning Yasser Arafat into a Nobel Peace Prize winner? And so you hear Eric is saying, oh, Barghouti, he's so popular, he's a leader among men. I don't like him, but he's a leader among men, and I'm laughing, I'm going, are you kidding me? Right? Aren't you tired of this? The forward there's no excuse for the forward. There may be an excuse for the New York Times. There's simply no excuse for the forward. And that's really all, it sums it up.
Eric.
I said what I said before on the basis of how I saw Barghouti. I'm not going to repeat that. I do want to say just a word about Jewish Voice for Peace. First of all, I want to suggest that people in this room, up here and down there, go to their website and read it from beginning to end. I have done that. And I'm wondering, based on what I've heard here, how many people have done that. It's very important to do that.
What would we find?
I'm not going to get into the details because I'm going to get to point two. Point two, because I simply have heard some information that I consider to be, not factually correct.
Just give us one example.
Second of all, they are a terrible organization.
But?
No but. Without redeeming value. An absolutely terrible organization, anti-Zionist and so on. But that doesn't mean they take any position that you assume that somehow is associated with anti-Zionism. So read through and see what their actual positions are. They're gray in some areas, horrible in others. Second of all, they are a terrible organization. We shouldn't see them in any other way. And third of all, this is very important, they are a Jewish organization. If we start looking at Jewish organizations and reading them out of the community and saying somehow they're no longer Jewish, then we lose the ability to communicate on any level. They are a terrible, horrible Jewish organization. But nonetheless, they are within the Jewish community. They identify in those terms, and that's the way everybody sees them.
Thane, can you accept that?
No. There's all sorts of other Jewish organizations that we don't... I'm just saying, this is absurd. First of all, there's all sorts of actual Jewish organizations that don't get to run ads in the forward. Why this one?
Which one?
I don't know. All I'm saying is
say it if you
no.
don't know.
But what I'm saying is it's so suspicious.
It's easy for you to say
it's so
things that you don't know anything about.
Weird to anybody watching this and saying, why them? And by the way, I want to go back. Floyd doesn't make a distinction between editorials and ads. And I think there is a distinction, because if you keep thinking that this is an expression worth hearing, why not put them on your editorial page? And there is a reason, I think it was Sam who gave us that long ago Supreme Court decision that talks about, good ideas cancel out bad ideas. I mentioned this in my new book. Sometimes bad ideas are bad for a reason. They're just bad ideas. And you don't need to give them space. There's nothing, forget the constitutional, it's not even right on any level. They're bad, that's why they're bad. And for the idea that we have to somehow treat Jewish Voice for Peace as a voice worth hearing because they have the word Jewish and voice in it is really bizarre to me. And you're right, maybe you do take ads from anybody, but the fact that you had no editorial discretion or commercial discretion to say, you know what, this is simply inappropriate for a Jewish newspaper.
You know what, we don't create a policy of that organization will take and this one we won't. But we've been asked, and we've refused to take an ad from a Jewish missionary organization.
What makes them worse than Jewish Voice for Peace?
Because for this, people who know the history of the Forward will appreciate the irony, but it's a Christian organization.
But they don't believe in dead Jews.
You know,
By the way, Eric, why that? They don't believe in dead Jews.
I'm okay with Jewish Christian missionary organizations that don't believe in the river to the sea.
I don't think-
I'm okay with them. They can come to my Shabbos table anytime.
Sam said something as an aside that was very interesting to me. He said there are Reform conservative rabbis, Reform rabbis, who will not talk about Israel from their pulpit, in their congregation. Is Sam right? And if he's right, why is that true?
I want to say that was an incredibly interesting thing that you said, Sam. So I don't reject everything you said. I'm glad you said that.
I wrote a long piece on that in the Reform magazine, and the New York Times ran a front page story that quoted me at some length on that topic.
You're always being quoted.
And the truth is, yes. First of all, let me tell you, I know of an Orthodox congregation in Manhattan, and I'm not going to give you the name.
Oh.
I'm not going to give you the name. But I know this for a fact, where they do not talk about Israel. They have a lot of university people, liberal, sort of unusual for the Orthodox world, but it's fascinating that their rabbis have discovered they simply cannot do it without it being so contentious and angry and divisive that they stay away. In the Reform and the conservative movement, a study was done, and some 20 to 25% of rabbis acknowledge that they stay away from the topic on a regular basis.
Because
Because it's simply too contentious. Because if they say anything, particularly even a mildly critical word, on any topic, there is a minority that will be so vicious in their criticism that they find it as simply not worth the bother.
And what about the converse? Are there rabbis who would be supportive of the state of Israel, but know if they express that to their Reformed congregation, the same kind of vitriol would come showering down upon them?
If you ask me, does that ever happen? And the
Ever?
answer, yes, rarely.
Oh.
Rarely.
All right.
The notion that being supportive is going to be a problem in the average congregation, I don't think that's primarily it. Look, we need to find a way to talk about Israel in a civil manner where we can share a diversity of views, and at the same time, we recognize there are going to be some red lines there.
Yep.
There are going to be some red lines there, but the part of the problem we have among young people, in my own view, is support among young people is stronger than sometimes we're inclined to think. But part of the problem we have is their sense that you can't have a civil conversation, and therefore why bother having a conversation at all? Right. And certainly any notion that criticism of any sort is in and of itself disloyalty is terribly destructive and does not strengthen Israel and does not help the Zionist cause. So
right.
We have to avoid that.
Okay. You get to conclude, but I want you to hear my perspective. And I'm now talking about what is JBS's philosophy. On JBS, you will hear Peter Beinart, Jeremy Ben-Ami, Dan Kurtzer. You'll hear Mort Klein. You'll hear a wide swath of the middle, Eric Yoffie, Thane Rosenbaum, on and on and on.
Thane is in the middle?
I said the swath.
Yeah.
Okay.
See, look, he's dragging me away from the right wing again.
Yeah. Cool.
My-
I thought I was put there forever now.
My point is, and here I say to myself, I am a Jewish television network. And I explained even before the panel began, my goal is to educate, inform, and to, in some way, inspire Jewish commitment and Jewish engagement. We have a line at JBS. The line is, if there's somebody who says there should be no Israel, you've crossed the line. If you argue against settlements, if you think Netanyahu is the worst thing ever happened in the state of Israel, if you love Netanyahu, if you think all of Judea Samaria should be incorporated in the state of Israel, all that will be heard on JBS. The one thing that will never be heard, I am not interested in giving a platform to someone who starts from a position that there should be no Israel. And, Floyd, I am frightened that in a very subtle way, that's at the heart of what this whole discussion is about. There are Jews who now believe Israel was a mistake, and that the only way for the Jews to be just is for Israel to become a one state, and ultimately they will not be the majority, and they can live in Eretz Yisrael, assuming there is a Palestinian community that will tolerate it, but that Israel, as far as they're concerned, should not be. My line is, you've crossed over, and JBS is not a place where I want that orientation. It just is, it's outside of the discussion, even if it is argued by someone who is clearly Jewish. That's my perspective. You've heard all of theirs. You make the summing comment.
Well, I'm sorry, but I agree with you. Lines have to be drawn. Every broadcaster draws lines. I mean, you don't see a lot of people on network television whenever they touch on the Middle East, and sometimes have pieces that pro-Israeli people find painful, but you hardly ever see anybody on who is advocating the end of the state of Israel, or the end of Israel being Jewish, a Jewish state. That's a decision without thinking about it that they've made. They've drawn their lines, and you've drawn yours, and I think they're very reasonable lines. I mean, when we have arguments in New York City about who can march in the Israel Day parade, we're talking about the arguments being about much narrower lines, and whether Peter Beinart ought to be allowed to be in the parade in the first place, or people who share his views.
The Israel parade.
Yeah. But I think the decisions that you've made are not just defensible, but entirely appropriate.
And as you hear this, and there has been a nuanced difference of opinion here, very beautifully articulated. Is there any conclusion that you come away with having, this is not your primary field, but you can apply your vision and your understanding of the First Amendment type issues that have preoccupied your work?
Well, look, the core First Amendment principle I mentioned earlier is an anti-censorial one. That means that the forward has the legal right, of course, but beyond legal right, First Amendment values would tell us that the forward ought to make its own decision about line drawing. And if you don't like the lines, maybe you don't have to read the forward. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not subject to criticism, and in my view, justifiable criticism for perhaps this decision. But it is not that First Amendment values requires every publisher to put on every view all the time. We ought to judge publications of more general circulation by our own standards of fairness, relevance, and the like. I think one of the things I've gathered from this discussion that I find very interesting. I mean, suppose the publication were not called the Jewish Forward. Suppose it was just the Forward. What would one want of it any differently? Yes, yes, yes.
But we all know what it is.
Everybody knows
Yes,
that.
it doesn't matter what the name
But
is.
suppose it had never been Jewish. Suppose the word has never been attached to it. Would one view it, would one sort of impose on it? I don't mean making them do it, but I mean wishing, wanting them to do it. Where would one want them to draw the lines any differently? Because I, at least, as you heard earlier, was saying that I thought the lines ought to be different because they hold themselves out as being a Jewish publication. If they didn't, maybe they don't, but if they didn't,
We certainly do.
or weren't viewed as a Jewish publication, we could have a very different discussion.
There is a saying, you know, you are a gentleman and a scholar. It's been an honor having you as part of a
Thank you very
Chaim
much.
panel. All of you, just marvelous. Aren't they all marvelous? I thank every single one of you. Beautifully done, beautifully done. There you have it, the thoughts of Floyd Abrams, Amanda Berman, Sam Norich, Thane Rosenbaum, and Eric Yoffie. And I don't know where else you hear this kind of discussion and the kind of give and take and the honesty from every one of them that you just heard. It was a privilege for me to sit in this seat. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to anything anybody said on this edition of L'Chaim. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. My thanks to many people. Joe Levy and the Center for Jewish History. Mazal Tov to you from strength to strength. And my thanks to this audience. You were fabulous. Thank you for the attention and for being part of the program. I hope we can do it again. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'Chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.